Hello and welcome to this latest NERI video. Today we'll be talking about the upcoming budget, which is coming up early this time around, and there's obviously a lot of context around this budget. This might be a budget that has a lot more attention paid to it than in recent years. But just to open out, before I go into setting a bit of the context around this, I'd like to introduce our panelists. Joining us today are Claudia Daly, and she's the manager of the Community Law and Mediation's recently established Centre for Environmental Justice. In 2021, CLM established the Centre for Environmental Justice, which works to ensure climate change and other environmental harms do not disproportionately affect those who've contributed least to the problem, and that the state's response to environmental challenges address inequality and protects the rights of present and future generations. And prior to that work, she worked as a researcher with the Effective Nature Laws project in UCD and acted as campaign coordinator for Climate Case Ireland. And Dr. Rory O'Farrell is an economist with over a decade of experience working with policy institutes, international organisations, and in academia. Rory currently lectures economics in TU Dublin. And up to August 2020, Rory worked with the OECD in Paris, having previously worked with ourselves and the ETUI in Brussels. Since completing his PhD in economics at the EUI in Florence, Rory's research can be found in journals such as Labour Economics and New Technology, Work and Employment. In addition, Rory has contributed to the media with articles appearing in the Irish Times and the Irish Independent. So I'd like to welcome the two of you, and I'm delighted you can join us. So just to set some context before I kind of turn over to yourselves. This budget, in the last few months, the government released its summer economic statement. In terms of additional money to sort of play around within this budget, that amounts to 6.7 billion. Government says about 5.65 billion of that is going to be additional public spending measures. Just over $1 billion is in additional tax measures. So that would be actually reductions in tax. And the budget, of course, this year has been moved forward by 2 weeks to September 27th. Typically, we're talking about this closer to October, but in response to the cost of living crisis. Overall, the public finances are said to be strong. Tax revenues are ahead of projection. So on a 12-month basis, the exchequer surplus is about 2.1 billion, according to government documentation, and about 25% to the end of June ahead of the same period last year, although a lot of that is related to inflated, really, corporate tax receipts. Now, in terms of some of the things that have been floated, we're obviously in the pre-budget season where many suggested policies come about. We have proposed measures for increased welfare rates of at least €10, increased child benefit, increased back to school allowance, reduction in third level fees, no increase in excise taxes on alcohol and cigarettes. Briefly, we saw floated a new 30% rate of income tax, although at the time of recording, that seems to have been rolled back a little bit. Additional credits on energy bills, so that'd be money to offset rises in energy, and an index link to income tax bands. So as incomes have increased, the idea would be to increase the threshold at which you pay additional tax. And this is all coming about in the context of the cost of living crisis. According to the CSO, their latest data, 9.1% year-on-year inflation in July, according to CPI, 9.6% according to the HICP. That's an alternative measure of inflation. And most notably, this is driven by increases in housing, water, electricity, gas, and other fuels. And that was 21.6% year-on-year, so very high. Transport, close to 20%. Alcoholic beverages and tobacco, 7.8%, and food, and that's 7.7%. But as the CSO have pointed out, in recent work, and this was when headline inflation was 6.7%, so lower than what has been sort of measured recently. This is the experience of inflation is different according to where you sit in the income scale. So for the bottom 10% of households, their inflation that they experienced was about 7.6% in March 2022, so about a point above the average inflation rate. And the top 10%, conversely, that was 6.1%. And at the bottom, most of their inflation is about electricity, gas, and things like rent, whereas at the top, transport hit harder. And renters saw higher than average inflation rates, and rent was the single largest component of experienced price growth in that sector. So we have a differentiated picture, and that kind of comes into our response to budget. So just to return back to our panelists, having kind of set out some of that context, I wonder, and either of you can sort of pick up to begin. What do you make of current kind of plans around this budget now? Maybe, you know, if you feel some of those suggested measures are more or less appropriate. Is the scale appropriate? Are we approaching cost of living crisis in the right way?
If you don't mind, I'll go ahead. I think it's important to look at the reason why inflation is so high in Ireland. And the reason is that the economy is bursting at the seams. It can't absorb a big injection of cash. So an increase in spending or tax cuts of over 6 billion, it'll cause further problems. And the reason, like, this is particularly the case in Ireland, even though energy price increases have gotten all the attention, there's a deeper problem in Ireland. That's in some ways it's been kind of hidden by the increase in energy prices. So what has happened is that after the relaxing of rules with COVID and so on, there was a surge in demand, but the economy wasn't in a position to supply it. And this is obvious when you look at the situation, let's say Dublin Airport in the summer at long queues, people trying to rent a car, or suppose you want to get some building work done and you can't find a builder. So the economy can't absorb a big injection of money. And as I said, it's particularly the case in Ireland. We've the highest core inflation in Western Europe. It's running at something like 5.8. So core inflation is when you strip out energy prices and food prices, which tend to change with the season. So an increase of 6.8 billion or thereabouts, it's more than can be absorbed. So we do need to increase spending in some areas to ensure that the most vulnerable households are protected. But if we do that, it should be paired off with tax increases in other areas, such as by increasing the property tax.
Thanks, Rory. And there's a few pieces in what you said I think we can explore further. But first, I'll just go over to Claudia. Do you feel any of those are those measures in the budget appropriately targeted? Are they looking at the right things to sort of address this cost of living crisis?
Yeah, I suppose before getting into the specific measures that are being proposed at the moment, it might be helpful to think about whether we're looking at this in the right way. And Rory correctly said that, you know, energy prices are getting a lot of attention because energy supply hasn't been able to meet demand since lockdown ended. Different sectors of the economy reopened, people started traveling and returning to the office again. But really this energy crisis is due to record gas prices as a result of this. So since January of 2021, gas prices have increased by 170% in Europe. And oil and gas account for more than 80% of Ireland's energy use. And then gas alone accounts for 50% of Ireland's electricity generation. So Ireland is much more exposed to this cost of living crisis than other countries. And this is made worse by the fact that our housing stock is really energy inefficient. So 48%, almost half of Ireland's housing stock is energy inefficient. And Irish homes are 60% more energy intensive than the EU average. And so had the government and had former governments prioritized energy efficiency and the development of renewable energy and home insulation, our demand for gas would be much lower. And the consequences of the energy crisis are really real and really life-changing for a lot of people who are now looking at choices between buying food or heating their home. And these price hikes are expected to stay in place until next winter. So it's possible that health inequalities will increase as well. And the elderly and clinically vulnerable are most at risk because when you live in a cold home, you have a higher chance of developing respiratory infection, of experiencing stress on your cardiovascular system. You can develop asthma or your asthma symptoms can worsen, and there's an increased risk in mental health issues as well. And so nobody should have to be making choices between eating or heating their home, and particularly when there was a lot of talk about building back better after lockdown, and also particularly at a time when energy companies are recording record-breaking profits. So from our point of view, the energy crisis should really be a wake-up call to the government to do what it should have done, you know, a long time ago and break its ties with the really volatile fossil fuel industry. And it also, I think, provides us with an opportune moment to think about how we can transition our energy system in a way that is actually fast and fair. And, you know, nationalizing our energy system might be the best way to go about this. France has recently done that. And if we had state control of our energy system, we would be able to kind of look at what's needed in terms of public value and social and economic and ecological benefits. Sinead Mercier has written an excellent paper that I'd recommend anyone read if they want to learn more. But yeah, happy to talk a little bit more about the proposed measures, but I might hand back over to yourselves if you have any comments on that.
Sure, yeah, we've a lot to kind of come into, that we're touching on a lot of things, but just to sort of return to you, Rory, you were kind of referring to the fact, and I think this sort of aligns with some of what Clodagh was saying. There's clear need in the Irish economy, and there are kind of pinch points here with people who are going to not be able to sort of support some of these price increases. And at the same time, we have a broader context where we don't want to worsen issues or sort of exacerbate, you know, those kind of pinch points on the supply side. So I wonder, would your perspective, Rory, be something like is it more of a sort of directed kind of expenditure approach, maybe some mix of tax rises? Because of course this 6.7 billion in general, when we talk about fiscal space, that dreaded word, we're talking about permitted expenditures given no real new kind of discretionary tax rises. So we do have the choice under current fiscal rules to impose new taxes if we want to fund projects over and above that. So do you think that's more the approach that the situation calls for?
Yes, I would. It's, even though like at the moment we do have a budget surplus, or the latest figures show that we're in a surplus, government surplus, and our debt to GDP ratio, you know, it's not great, but it's not awful. It's not an immediate concern. There is a chance of a recession quite soon happening in the UK and in the United States and in the EU. So it'd be good to, instead of spending lots of money this year, keep it in reserve for the following year when there's likely to be a recession. But still, what can we do this year, for example? There's two main bottlenecks which I can see in the economy. One is related to transport, which Clodagh has mentioned, and to do with our use of fossil fuels and so on. And the other main one is housing. And the housing, we'll say bottleneck, the housing crisis is absolutely fundamental to some of the other problems that we're having in the economy. So, for example, the rate of job vacancies being posted is at its highest since they started counting them back in 2008, but there hasn't been as much of a move in unemployment rates. And partly that's because people, even though they might like to get a job, let's say in a nearby town or whatever, they can't afford to move. So a choice has to be made in the short term about which should we prioritize? Should we prioritize, let's say, retrofitting existing housing, or should we prioritize building new housing first to solve that problem, and then come back to the retrofitting? Because at the moment there is, as I said, there's a lack of, let's say, tradespeople to do the work and so on. So we can't, in the next year, we can't just pump in a lot of money into that sector. So what we need for our housing, I think, is more of a longer term plan. We need a proper strategy for delivering social housing. At the moment, we have too many approved housing bodies that are, let's say, competing with each other for sites, which is bidding up the cost of sites and so on. So we need a program of building social housing that's, let's say, for 5 years, because at the moment we can see there is a lot of building work going on. If you're in Dublin, for example, you can see lots of cranes, lots of apartments being built. And in general, the new housing stock, like apartments, will be more energy efficient than the old housing stock. But that could come to a pause in a year or two. So I'd like then the government to have plans ready now, like and by plans, I mean the actual architectural plans for new building, new social housing, and be ready to build it, let's say at the start of 2024, when the economy might start to go into a bit of a downturn. With regard to transport, the government did take one measure, and it's almost been glanced over in when they cut excise duty on petrol. And it's estimated that costs something like 436 million a year. And if you can think of any other decision, let's say it was a decision to put a university in Waterford, or a decision to increase public sector pay, or anything that was going to cost 436 million, a lot more thought would have gone into it. And yet that decision was made almost overnight. I'd much prefer if, instead of that money being taken off excise duty, it be put into projects that solve the problem, because excise duty is mainly paid by people with bigger cars, and which tend to be more well-off households. So I'd much rather instead, well, if they reverse the decision on cutting excise duty on petrol and diesel, put it back up, but instead use that money to subsidize, we'll say, in the cities, to subsidize public transport, to subsidize, to build cycle infrastructure, and maybe make buying the purchase of e-bikes or electronic bikes more attractive. Because if you can do 5 kilometers cycle on a pedal bike, you might be able to do 20 on an electric bike. And that's far more energy efficient than using a car. And in a way, it's a quick fix. The other thing, though, is we have to be aware of the problems of transport in rural Ireland. And in rural Ireland, they've been hit more by the increase in fuel costs. And what I'm going to say for rural Ireland is I'm going to propose not having a national solution to that. The problems of, we'll say, rural transport in Donegal will be very different to the ones in Offaly, for example. In Offaly, they've got, I think it's the Royal Canal going through, that's suitable for cycling. They don't have things like that in Donegal. So what I'd rather is that a pot of money being made available, and let the county councils or rural communities come up with their own solutions for how they want to deal with the problems of transport in rural Ireland. For some areas, it might be that they want to put on a minibus that can bring people to the local village, or to bring people, to the local pub and things like that. A different place might want to invest more in things to do with cycling or whatever. But let each county come up with their own solution, and the government can be there, national government can be there to provide money to help make that happen.
Yeah, thanks, Rory. That's very interesting. I think I'm hearing in both of your kind of contributions as well. Is there a certain sense in which this budget, in addressing kind of issues as they're rising in the short term, for example, Rory, you just brought up the fuel excise, are we at risk really of kind of setting out kind of divergent directions in policy? We obviously, another kind of piece of background that I probably should have put in the introduction is we've had, one of the hottest summers ever, and it's becoming increasingly clear that, climate change is worsening, and it's increasingly tangible. So is there a sense, are those two pieces, or is long-term government policy now a little bit at odds with these short-term responses? Is that kind of long-term picture, where you also kind of pointed to big structural issues? Are we kind of failing a little bit really around budgets to sort of congeal something like a long-term plan to really address some of these kind of structural problems? I might go to you, Clodagh, first, and then Rory, if you want to pop in.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. And I think it's becoming increasingly clear that the government doesn't really have the luxury anymore of addressing one crisis at a time. We are living through a climate crisis, a biodiversity crisis, a housing and a cost of living crisis. That's also happening in the context of war against Ukraine. So yeah, there needs to be a really coordinated and kind of holistic approach. And there's also, I think, a lot of opportunities within this budget to kind of leverage and accelerate a transition to a completely decarbonized economy and society in a way that's fair and in a way that meets people's housing needs, energy needs, and cost of living needs. So some of the, I might just briefly address some of the measures that are actually being proposed, if that's all right, to address energy poverty. So one is that there is likely to be an increase in the fuel allowance scheme, or potentially a one-off lump sum credit for electricity bills of about €200. But much more than that is actually needed to assist households through what's going to be a very long-term crisis. So the fuel allowance scheme should be doubled from €33 to €66. This recommendation has also been proposed by the Economic and Social Research Institute. It should be available for 32 weeks of the year, because that's how often it used to be available. But currently it's only available for 28 weeks of the year, and it needs to be claimed in advance of the winter period. At the moment, it's too strictly means tested. So those who are on the working family payment and those who are on job seekers payment for less than a year aren't eligible to claim fuel allowance. And it's not really targeted effectively to reach members of the traveller community who are disproportionately impacted by energy poverty. So the national traveller maps have recommended, for example, that each family living on the same site should be treated as an individual household and should have access to the fuel allowance scheme kind of accordingly. And in terms of, longer term measures that the government could do to make sure that we don't face further energy and electricity shocks, they could provide for the energy regulator, the Commission for the Regulation of Utilities, to review Ireland's energy pricing formula and to make sure that communities are protected from future gas and electricity price shocks. And they could also provide for the regulator to remove standing charges on energy bills and to ensure that energy providers are all allocating the lowest energy rate to all of their users. Often what people are advised to do if they're living in energy poverty or at risk of energy poverty is to shop around and to change their provider on a regular basis to avail of the most competitive rate. But, those who are living in energy poverty may not have the bandwidth to do that. And Ofgem, the UK energy regulator, have already implemented measures like this. Another thing that could be done is the government could write off consumer debt. That's been implemented in Catalonia. Prepayment electricity measures could also be scrapped, and they really should be, because low-income households might have a lot of difficulty in keeping their meter topped up and then can be disconnected immediately. And of course, energy poverty isn't a result of excess consumption. Those living in energy poverty are living in inadequate, living on an inadequate income and living in poorly insulated housing. So yeah, the prepayment electricity meters may just be pushing more people into energy poverty rather than incentivizing behavioral change. And then finally, the government could develop an energy guarantee. So this is a proposal that's been put forward by Age Action Ireland. So this would be where people living in poorly insulated homes and those on low incomes would have a guaranteed unit of energy regardless of the cost. And that payment would be indexed to the current cost of energy that's required to keep a person's home warm based on a set of quantity units. And another measure that we would think would be fair, and one that's been proposed by the International Energy Agency, would be to impose a windfall tax on energy companies. The European Commission recently approved temporary taxation measures on energy and utility companies to help provide consumers with relief from really high energy prices. And this proposal has received support from government members, both in opposition and within government parties. And I think it is a very reasonable demand, given that Gosh Energy have seen an increase in profits of 74%. The ESB have recorded an operating profit of €679 million. And Vermilion Energy, the Canadian oil and gas company that own Clodagh, have seen an increase of 250% in their profits. So, collecting additional taxation in that way could allow more people to be brought in under the fuel allowance scheme, could allow us to scale up our retrofit efforts. So I think that there's a lot of opportunity to do a lot more to protect households who are going to be most impacted this winter.
I think it's interesting, the idea of the windfall tax. And I think even if there was no war in Ukraine, that over the long term, we have to move away from using fossil fuels anyway. And in some ways, in the same way that the COVID pandemic kind of accelerated moves towards working from home and digitalization and so on, I think the war in Ukraine is can have a similar effect, hopefully towards directing us towards weaning ourselves off fossil fuels, rather than moving back towards coal and so on. So I found it interesting this morning to hear even ISME, the Irish Small and Medium Enterprises organisation, calling for a wind tax. And I think there's good ideas for scope for a windfall tax on energy companies. What I would like, though, is that if such a tax is introduced, that we allow them, if they promise to, let's say, ring fence the profits, the windfall gains they've made, into investing in renewable energy schemes, that they could, we'll say, claw it back on that. So tell them they've got a windfall gain this year, they have to put it to a long-term use, such as by investing there's lots of renewable energy schemes, whether it's wind farms or solar or whatever. And there's one other bottleneck that I think is worth addressing as well, and it comes up every year, and this is related to childcare. And again, it's a situation where we don't have a quick, for this one, we don't really have a quick fix. It's a long-term problem for Ireland, that Ireland, for the gender employment gap between men and women without children, there's no gap. But for women with children, or for mothers, there is a gap. And we have quite a wide employment gap between men and women by Western European standards. Now, it is higher in countries like Italy and Greece, but compared to the rest of Western Europe, Ireland has quite high employment gap. And one of the reasons being put forward for this is childcare. And I think there is serious problems in the childcare sector, that it's more than an issue of just putting money into it. And I think it would be worthwhile investigating how they deal with childcare, the childcare system in other countries, such as using, in Denmark, it's a municipal-based system. So again, I'd like it to be, something more in the power of, we'll say, local government, that they would see how many childcare places are provided and be able to give secure jobs to people working in the sector, and then people living in the community they'd know that they'd be able to get a childcare place for their child if they need it. The other thing, though, that would help impact it, and it could be done quickly, is that there's only 2 weeks paternity leave. So for a father with a new child, they get 2 weeks. Whereas for the mother, it's I think 6 months, and you can add on time that's unpaid. So in effect, what the state is saying is that it's we'll say it's almost like it's the dad's responsibility to look after the kid for 2 weeks, for the mother, 6 months plus. You could bring it up to add on unpaid leave and so on. I don't think that paternity leave should be at the same number of weeks as maternity leave, because there's also the time for recovery from a pregnancy and so on that new mothers need. But I would certainly like it to be brought up for paternity leave, so that one solution for the childcare issues would be just to give the dads another few months so that they can look after the kid. They can, I don't know, bring it out the back, have the child out the back garden, playing, knocking a ball around, or watching them tumble over and so on, depending on how old they are. Should be part of the solution. And it shouldn't be just about increasing the amount of money to give to parents to go to childcare places.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And again, I suppose it comes back to this. There's big picture things that seem to have been kind of lost out in that sort of narrow budgeting process, as it were. As we've pointed out several times, we agree with you, Rory, that particularly that childcare issue, if you're looking at sort of the long run potential for the Irish economy, that gap between men and women is something that you could, if you address that just reaps all sorts of benefits. We'd be talking a potential budget with higher kind of employment rates for women, where you don't have these kind of blockages related to childcare, would be one where we'd have more money to play around with. We'd be a wealthier society in that respect. Now, I suppose we have a few minutes before we close out, so maybe I'll be going to Rory, just because you suggested kind of a few policy measures. If we say pretended that you're sitting in Pascal's chair, and you can drop, or at least drop a policy that you'd like, that you think would have a big bang for your buck this year, what would you go for?
For this year, I suppose I have to cheat a bit and say it have to be like a 5-year plan for housing. That this year, the economy probably can't take a big injection in money. So I'd rather instead this year they focus, we'll say, on more structural reforms, fixing issues about to do with childcare and I suppose the best bang for your buck would be this year would be things that don't have a direct outlay of money. So bringing in reforms to childcare, to how we provide social housing. Those things, they don't have a cash cost. So do those, and then there are the issues that Clodagh said about, which are kind of about helping people in the immediate future with regard to fuel allowance and so on. So yeah, I suppose my big thing will be to look at how to reform the social housing, how we provide housing and social housing, so that hopefully by 2024, well, unfortunately, by 2024, the economy will likely have cooled down, and that'll be the right time to put money into it, so that if there's unemployed builders, they'll have a job building social housing.
And Claudia, I know you've gone through a few measures, but would there be any kind of in particular that you think might, be particularly effective?
Well, I might follow Rory's lead and look at more structural change that's needed. So we would be calling for legislative reform to kind of tackle energy poverty in the long term. So Ireland's last energy poverty strategy lapsed in 2019, 3 years ago. And so at the moment, we have no comprehensive framework to measure, monitor, and tackle energy poverty. The consultation, though, on the forthcoming energy poverty is actually open at the moment. So if anybody watching this is interested in having their say in the consultation, we would really recommend that you do that. If you visit Community Law and Mediation's website, we have some recommendations for what we would like to see the government include in their strategy. And basically what we're calling for is the government to adopt a rights-based approach, because access to adequate levels of energy, is really a precondition to the realization of so many of our rights. It impacts our lives, our health, our living standards, and it's even impacting on people's employment opportunities, with a lot of workplaces now adopting a remote or hybrid approach. And a rights-based approach kind of facilitates better coherence and coordination across departments, at least in theory, because energy poverty falls across the remit of multiple departments, including, for example, environment, housing, health, and social protection. And it also clarifies the obligation of government as the obligation that government has in meeting people's rights, that, you know, citizens are rights holders in that way. So yeah, we would really recommend people have their say in that. And another, as part of our recommendations for the new energy poverty strategy, we're calling for the government to develop an Energy Poverty Act, and that would really guarantee long-term political accountability and commitment towards the eradication of energy poverty. A similar act was introduced in Scotland in 2019, and that includes some really sensible measures that we should have here. So a new framework and measurement definition for energy poverty, which would require the state to regularly measure energy poverty, targets to eliminate energy poverty, with the government having to report on those targets every 5 years, and an independent advisory council, or kind of a watchdog body, to make sure that the government actually is meeting its objectives under the legislation. So yeah, those are some of those structural changes that we would like to see.
Brilliant. And I think we're kind of coming to time here, but it seems we kind of have some agreement here that there's, as we've said a few times, really, that there's a bigger picture here, and it's not simply just about a direct, immediate fiscal policy. That we need to kind of focus on many of these kind of outstanding policy issues, and really build kind of capacity in various areas, whether it be housing or in addressing energy poverty. And so we'll leave it there. I'd like to sort of thank my two guests for their time today. As far as the NERI are concerned, this won't be the end of budget coverage. I'm sure we'll be, you know, in touch with the two of you, and I'm sure you'll be commenting in your own right. And I'd encourage watchers to follow our contributors' work. I'd also signal in the next couple of weeks, we have our 10th annual Donald Nevin lecture, and that is with Sharon Donnery. She's the Deputy Governor at the Central Bank of Ireland, and that's directly related to some of what we've spoken about here, the issue of inflation. So do come along to that. And of course, we will have responses to the budget. So again, thank you to our panelists, to our guests. Thank you for your contributions. It's been a really interesting discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you.